April 28, 1945. The village of Giulino di Mezzegra lay in uneasy silence. War had rolled across Italy for years, leaving towns scarred and hearts hardened. In the late afternoon light, two prisoners were brought to a stone wall outside Villa Belmonte. One was a man once hailed as the savior of a nation. The other, a young woman whose loyalty had defied reason and fear alike. A few bursts of gunfire shattered the stillness, and with them ended one of the most turbulent eras in modern Italian history. Benito Mussolini's journey to that wall had begun more than 2 decades earlier, when Italy teetered on the edge of collapse. In the early 1920s, the country was exhausted by the First World War, its economy shattered, its veterans angry and unemployed, its streets roiled by strikes and political violence. The liberal monarchy of King Victor Emmanuel III appeared powerless. Across the nation, socialist and communist movements rose in strength, calling for revolution, while nationalists and conservatives warned that Italy was on the brink of chaos. It was a moment ripe for a man who promised order, pride, and a return to greatness. That man was Benito Mussolini. Once a socialist agitator and newspaper editor, he had reinvented himself as the fiery leader of the fascist movement. His black shirts, paramilitary thugs in black uniforms, marched through cities, attacking leftists, silencing dissent, and projecting strength. In October 1922, Mussolini staged what would later be mythologized as the March on Rome. In truth, it was less a military seizure of power than a calculated gamble. Thousands of fascists gathered outside the capital, while Mussolini himself waited safely in Milan. But the threat of violence worked. Fearing civil war and impressed by Mussolini's boldness, the king appointed him prime minister. At 39, Mussolini became one of Europe's youngest leaders. In the years that followed, he dismantled Italy's fragile democracy piece by piece. Opposition newspapers were shut down, rival parties banned, and critics arrested or exiled. In 1925, Mussolini openly declared himself Il Duce, the leader, and turned Italy into a one-party dictatorship. Through propaganda and pageantry, he crafted a mythic image, the tireless man of destiny, restoring the Roman spirit to a humiliated nation. He spoke from balconies with thundering rhetoric, his chin raised toward the sky, his jaw set in theatrical defiance. To the crowds below, he appeared invincible, yet behind the grandeur lay fear and repression. The secret police, OVRA, monitored the population. Censorship stifled every whisper of dissent. Even as Mussolini presented himself as a modern Caesar, the foundation of his rule was built on intimidation. His regime glorified war, obedience, and virility, teaching that Italy's destiny was conquest and empire. That dream found its outlet in 1935 when Mussolini invaded Ethiopia. The war was brutal and one-sided, fought with poison gas and overwhelming force. The League of Nations condemned the invasion, but Mussolini dismissed their protests. The victory elevated his prestige, convincing many Italians that fascism had restored national pride. It also drew him closer to another rising dictator, Adolf Hitler. By 1939, the two had sealed their alliance with the Pact of Steel, binding Italy's future to Nazi Germany's ambitions. As Mussolini's power expanded abroad, his private life mirrored his hunger for control. Though married to Rachele Guidi, his lifelong companion, he kept numerous mistresses. One of them, however, would come to define his final years, Clara Petacci. When Mussolini met her in 1932, she was 20 years old, a devout admirer who had idolized him since adolescence. Their relationship grew rapidly from adoration to obsession. Clara filled diaries with praise and longing, describing him as a divine figure. Mussolini, flattered by her devotion, kept her close, so close that her presence became a fixture in his life. She followed him to official events, telephoned him nightly, and even influenced small decisions in his circle. For her family, the affair brought privileges, jobs, gifts, protection. But for Mussolini, Clara was more than a mistress. She was a mirror reflecting the myth he had built for himself. To her, he was immortal. To him, she was proof that his charisma still held power over hearts. But the illusion of greatness began to crumble when war returned to Europe. In 1939, Mussolini hesitated as Hitler invaded Poland, declaring Italy a non-belligerent state. He boasted that he would join the war only when the right moment arrived, when others had already bled. That moment came in June 1940, after France collapsed under German assault. Convinced that the conflict was nearly over, Mussolini declared war on France and Britain, promising Italians a quick victory and a place in the sun. What followed was a disaster. Italy's army was ill-equipped, poorly trained, and short on modern weapons. Campaigns in Greece and North Africa turned into humiliating defeats. Mussolini's forces were repeatedly rescued by German intervention, first in Greece, then in Libya, and finally on the Eastern Front, where tens of thousands of Italian soldiers perished in the frozen wastes near Stalingrad. By 1943, Italy's cities were under Allied bombardment, food was scarce, and public morale collapsed. The myth of Mussolini's infallibility disintegrated. That July, Allied troops landed in Sicily. Within weeks, the fascist Grand Council, his own creation, turned against him. On July 25, 1943, King Victor Emmanuel III summoned Mussolini to the palace, informed him he was dismissed, and had him arrested on the spot. For the first time in 2 decades, the Duce was powerless. Clara Petacci, too, was briefly detained. When she was released, she sought desperately to find him, still unable to accept that the man she worshipped was a prisoner. Mussolini's fall seemed complete, but in September, in a daring commando raid orchestrated by Hitler, German paratroopers rescued him from his mountain prison at Gran Sasso. The operation, led by Otto Skorzeny, became a propaganda triumph. Days later, Mussolini appeared beside Hitler in Germany, thin, trembling, visibly aged. His old vigor was gone. Hitler offered him a hollow prize, leadership of a new fascist government, the Italian Social Republic, headquartered in the northern lakeside town of Salo. In reality, it was a puppet regime, entirely dependent on German power. At Salo, Mussolini was more a figurehead than a ruler. His decrees carried little authority. His speeches no longer inspired. Italy itself had dissolved into civil war, partisans against fascists, Germans against allies, neighbor against neighbor. Yet, Clara Petacci returned to him, choosing devotion over safety. She moved into his guarded villa on Lake Garda, living among German officers and frightened loyalists. To her, he was still the man destined to lead Italy. She wrote him tender notes, urging him to believe that fortune would turn once more. To those around them, her faith seemed delusional, but also touching in its blindness. For Mussolini, her loyalty was both a comfort and a curse, reminding him of a grandeur that had long since vanished. By 1945, the walls of that illusory republic began to collapse. Allied forces pushed north, German troops retreated toward Austria, and partisan control spread across northern Italy. Mussolini's health deteriorated. He suffered from ulcers, fatigue, and despair. He confessed to aides that he was finished, that history had defeated him. Yet when Clara begged him to flee, he refused to abandon her. When she begged to accompany him, he could not say no. On April 25, 1945, Mussolini decided to escape. The plan was to reach Switzerland, where he might seek asylum, or at least safety before the inevitable Allied capture. He joined a convoy of retreating German soldiers and fascist officials, disguised in a helmet and greatcoat. The procession wound north along Lake Como, a landscape both beautiful and haunted. Villages that once welcomed his speeches now looked on in silent hatred. Partisan checkpoints appeared unpredictably, and every mile risked discovery. Clara sat beside him through the journey, unwavering. Friends had pleaded with her to stay behind, but she refused. Her devotion had become fatalistic. If Mussolini was doomed, she would share his fate. Witnesses later described her as calm, even defiant, comforting him as his silence deepened. Mussolini spoke little, his face pale, his eyes hollow. The man who had once dreamed of empire was now a fugitive, his world reduced to a few miles of mountain road, and the woman holding his hand. The convoy reached the village of Dongo on April 27th. There, partisan fighters blocked the road. Armed men surrounded the vehicles, demanding identification from all passengers. German troops hesitated, but soon realized resistance was useless. The partisans began pulling men from the trucks, checking their faces against lists of wanted fascists. In the back of one vehicle, a partisan noticed an odd, weary-looking man sitting silently. His disguise, a German helmet pulled low, could not conceal his face. Urbano Lazzaro, one of the partisans, later said Mussolini looked spiritually dead. He was dragged out without struggle. Clara followed, pleading with the fighters not to harm him, but her words were lost in the tension. The captured dictator was taken to Mezzagra, a nearby village, and confined in a farmhouse under heavy guard. Clara was kept nearby, begging to see him. Mussolini spoke little, staring into space, resigned to what he knew was coming. Outside, word of his capture spread like wildfire. In Milan, crowds gathered, demanding vengeance. To many Italians, Mussolini was not merely a fallen leader, but the embodiment of years of hunger, death, and humiliation. They did not want a trial, they wanted a reckoning. Among the partisan command, debate raged. Some argued for a formal trial. Others warned that delay could bring a rescue attempt from German forces still retreating nearby. In the end, the decision came swiftly. Walter Audizio, known by his nom de guerre, Colonel Valerio, was chosen to carry out the execution. With him went Aldo Lampredi, another veteran of the resistance. Their orders were simple and final. Mussolini and Clara Petacci were to die. On the afternoon of April 28, 1945, a small car drove them to the village of Giulino di Mezzagra. Locals watched from behind shutters as the convoy stopped outside Villa Belmonte. Mussolini emerged from the car, his body slouched, his movements slow. Clara clutched his hand tightly, refusing to let go. They were led to a low stone wall at the roadside. Witnesses later gave differing accounts. Some said Mussolini appeared broken and pathetic. Others claimed he stood in quiet resignation. Perhaps both were true. The man who once claimed to shape destiny now faced his own, with no illusion left. Clara refused to step aside when ordered, clinging to his arm until the end. She begged to die with him, and her wish was granted. Audizio raised his submachine gun. The weapon chattered briefly. Mussolini fell backward, struck in the chest. Clara screamed and lunged toward him. A second burst cut her down. The sound faded, replaced by silence. In that instant, 2 decades of fascist rule ended not with ceremony, but with 2 bodies against a wall in a quiet Italian village. The following morning, the corpses of Mussolini, Clara, and other executed fascists were loaded onto trucks and taken to Milan. Their destination was Piazzale Loreto, a square already steeped in blood. Less than a year before, German troops had executed 15 Italian partisans there, leaving their bodies displayed as a warning. Now, vengeance returned to the same spot. The bodies were dumped on the pavement. Crowds gathered, swelling into thousands. Rage, grief, and years of suffering exploded into chaos. People spat, kicked, and cursed the bodies. Some struck them with sticks. Others tore at their clothing. One woman recalled later, "I spat on him. It was all I could do to control the mob." Partisans strung the corpses by their heels from a metal girder of a nearby petrol station. Photographs captured the scene. Mussolini, head downward, beside Clara Petacci, her skirt hanging over her face, both lifeless, surrounded by a crowd shouting in triumph and fury. The images traveled across the world. For many, it was a grim symbol of justice. For others, a spectacle of vengeance. Either way, the man who once ruled with propaganda now became the ultimate example of its destruction. The dictator who had lived by image died as an image. American troops arrived later that day and took the bodies down. Autopsies confirmed multiple gunshot wounds to Mussolini's chest and heart, and evidence of further abuse after death. Clara's body, too, bore marks of the mob's fury. Her family would later recover her remains and bury her quietly. Mussolini's body was not given peace so easily. Loyalists stole it from a cemetery the following year, hiding it for months before police found it again. Only in 1957 was it finally returned to his widow and interred in the Mussolini family crypt in Predappio. Even today, visitors still come, some to condemn, others to mourn, and a few to worship. News of his death raced across Europe. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler received the reports in his underground bunker. The photographs of Mussolini's mutilated corpse shocked him. He saw in them his own future, a defeated tyrant humiliated by his own people. Determined to avoid that fate, Hitler made his decision. 2 days later, he married Eva Braun, his longtime mistress, and soon after, the two took their own lives. Their bodies were burned, as Hitler had ordered, denying the world any chance to display them as Mussolini's had been. The parallel between Mussolini and Hitler, between Clara Petacci and Eva Braun, was stark. Both men had risen to power through charisma, fear, and spectacle. Both had been sustained by illusions of destiny, and both, in their last hours, were accompanied by women who loved them to the point of self-destruction. Their deaths symbolized not just the collapse of fascist regimes, but the tragic cost of blind devotion to ideology, to power, and to men who believed themselves immortal. For Italy, Mussolini's death closed a chapter written in blood and spectacle. His rule had begun with parades, slogans, and promises of glory. It ended with silence, bullets, and the fury of a crowd. Yet even in death, he staged a final performance, his body becoming the ultimate symbol of his rise and fall. He had once believed that history would remember him as a maker of empires. Instead, it remembered him as a warning, a man destroyed by the myth he created. And so, in a small Italian village, as the sun faded over Lake Como, the era of the Duce ended. But his shadow lingered across Italy, across Europe, and across history itself, a reminder that power built on spectacle can die only in spectacle. Mussolini's story ended against a wall, but the echo of that gunfire carried far beyond Giuliano di Mezzegra into the heart of a continent still reckoning with its own descent into darkness.